Your hands were made for greatness. Mighty hands for painting, paneling, and clicking the submit order button on HomeDepot.com to get that duvet. And these Egyptian cotton towels delivered right to your door. Do more with decor at the Home Depot. Save up to 30% on select bedding and bath. Now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Enter promo code BEDBATH15 at purchase for an extra 15% off. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility. Today we're going to be talking about seeking closure when disposing of unused embryos. This is a topic that is often not discussed, so that's what we're here for, to discuss those topics that are not often discussed. This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility Education and Support Nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm your host and the director of Creating a Family. And you can find us and all of our resources online at creatingafamily.org. For women who have been undergoing fertility treatment and are still struggling to conceive, Ferring wants you to know about Ferring Pharmaceutical, who is the underwriter of this show. I should have mentioned that. Wants you to know about the Ferticom app. It was designed specifically to help women address the many challenging emotional life situations that arise throughout the entire infertility struggle. Daily scenarios and interactions can truly take a toll on your emotional health, and the Ferticom app is here to help. You can find it at ferticomapp.com. In addition to the Ferring, there are other agencies and clinics who believe in our mission of providing unbiased, medically accurate information to the patient community. One such clinic is Reproductive Medicine Associates of New York. They are one of the largest fertility practices in the state of New York and truly one of the biggest in the country. By combining the latest innovations in the reproductive sciences with compassionate and customized treatment plans, RMA of New York is able to provide the very best possible care. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of compassionate transfer or disposal ceremonies for embryo disposition. The whole idea is how do you find closure when you are disposing of unused embryos? And I'll be frank, for some people they don't need closure. It's not a problem, and simply disposing of the embryos through thaw and disposal is fine for them. But there are others who it isn't fine, and they are struggling, and this show is for them. We will be talking with Dr. Kristen Wright. She is a reproductive endocrinologist at the Reproductive Science Center of New England's New Hampshire clinics, and she was also a former assistant professor of reproductive endocrinology. We will also be talking with Patricia Sachs. She is a clinical social worker and an infertility counselor. And both Dr. Wright and Patricia Sachs work with patients who are having to make a decision on what to do with their unused embryos. And we will be exploring various options you have, if indeed you are one of those people, or you think you'll be one of those people, who might have trouble making decisions on how best to dispose of them. This is a re-airing of a show that we did a few years back. I think that you will find it very helpful and an important topic to cover once again. Enjoy. Welcome, Dr. Kristen Wright and Patricia Sachs, to Creating a Family.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, frozen embryos are created with virtually every IVF cycle performed in the United States. I think it probably helps for the listeners, particularly those who might not be intimately familiar with IVF and infertility treatment, to understand why it is considered the preferred option to have enough embryos left over to freeze. Dr. Wright, can you talk about just the philosophy as to why do we end up freezing so many embryos?
Yes. So typically we will select a number of embryos to transfer during a fresh cycle in order to optimize the chance of pregnancy but decrease the risk of multiple birth. And after we've chosen that number, there may be embryos of high quality left over that were not transferred during the fresh cycle. And those can be frozen and stored for later use. The advantage of that is that if a couple doesn't become pregnant with the fresh IVF cycle, or if they want a sibling down the line, those frozen embryos are available for them to use for that purpose. And doing a frozen embryo transfer is substantially cheaper and easier than doing a fresh cycle because with a fresh cycle we have to give hormonal injections to stimulate the ovaries, whereas with a frozen embryo transfer we just have to give medications which can usually be given orally or vaginally to prepare the lining of the uterus for implantation, or we can even just perform the embryo transfer at the appropriate time in the menstrual cycle without using hormonal therapy at all.
So it's a whole lot less taxing on the woman's body to not have to go through the ovulatory stimulation. I mean, am I correct there?
Exactly. It's a much less rigorous procedure.
Yeah, so it saves money, and it is, although we think IVF is safe, this is clearly would be safer for the woman.
Correct. As
well. All right. So, and as far as what is the current national or success rate for frozen embryo transfers for implantation and live pregnancy, or pregnancy rate, I should say?
Yeah, according to national summary data for women under the age of 35, the number of percentage of transfers that results in a live birth is approximately 35%.
And that's from frozen embryo?
That's for frozen embryos.
And how does that compare to fresh?
It's a little bit less than fresh. So fresh cycles between a 40 and a 50% chance of live birth per transfer for the under 35 population.
Okay. So, so, in your clinic, what percentage of your cycles are fresh, and what percentage would be frozen, Dr. Wright?
The majority of cycles are fresh cycles. I would say our frozen embryo transfers are probably 20 to 25% perhaps of our fresh embryo transfer cycles.
Patricia, do you know, you were with the psychological counseling part of Shady Grove, so it would be fair not to know this, but do you happen to know if Shady Grove's percentages are about the same as far as between fresh and frozen?
As far as cycles or success rates?
Either one.
Yeah, I really don't know for sure, so I don't want to misspeak. I would say that success rates that she quoted probably are in the general ballpark for IVF using one's own eggs as opposed to donor eggs. Yeah. Okay.
Now, so as a result, with each cycle, IVF cycle, we end up if it is successful, at least how we're currently defining success, I should add, there will be leftover embryos of high enough quality to freeze so that patients have the option of choosing a frozen embryo cycle over a fresh cycle to either because it's the only thing they can afford or because they don't want for the woman to go through the ovulatory stimulation meds again. So as a result, we tend to have we're gaining on but many people choose to do a fresh cycle again, not to use their frozen embryos because, as you point out, their success rate is not quite as high. Therefore, we're ending up with more and more frozen embryos. The exact number is not known, but it is likely to be well over 500,000 now. And the options, once families have finished, either they have achieved the number of children they want or they have decided not to keep trying, they are then faced with the decision of what to do with these frozen embryos. And the options that are currently available for them for disposing of these embryos are, one, storing for future pregnancy attempts. And obviously, when you're first freezing them, almost everybody is attempting to do that because they don't know whether or not the fresh cycle is going to be successful. But then another option would be thawing and disposing the embryos, frozen embryos. Another one would be donating to another couple to try to have a baby, for them to try to have a baby. Another one would be to keep the embryos frozen forever, simply continue to pay and pay every month, but just not make a decision. And then another option is donate the embryos to research. And then an option we don't often mention, well, actually, there's two other options I'm going to throw out there. One that we don't often mention is that some people simply abandon and stop paying, and their embryos remain frozen. And another one that I never see mentioned, but when and I have went through a period where I interviewed a lot of people making this decision. And another option that is seldom mentioned, it would pretty well fall under storing for future pregnancy attempts, is people who, but for the existence of these embryos, would be finished with their family. But because these embryos exist, they decide to go ahead and try for another baby. And I ran into a surprising number, in my opinion, of people who chose that option. Anyway, I should mention at this point that, and let me back up, under the thaw and dispose option, some patients have said that they would prefer some variation on this theme, such as what we're calling a compassionate transfer, which is the transfer of the frozen embryos into usually the vagina, although we'll talk about exactly what you mean by that in a minute, at a time where an infertile time of the woman's cycle, so that it is almost impossible that she would conceive. And another variation on the thaw and discard is thaw and discard with some type of ceremony. And the focus of this show is going to be on the options, alternatives to simply thawing and discarding. Let me mention at this point that Creating a Family does not take a position on which option patients should choose. We try to provide medically accurate, unbiased resources on all the options, trusting patients to make, the best decision for themselves. But they do need information in order to make this decision, and there seems to be a dearth of information available for patients when they're trying to decide. And research, interestingly, has shown that patients are not thrilled with any of the standard disposal options, with one study showing that only 60% of those who had unused embryos and they were not intending to use them to create another pregnancy for themselves or attempt to create a pregnancy for themselves. Only 60% of those said they were very likely to choose any of the standard options. And I should mention that a lot of research does show of the standard options, the one preferred most often would be donating to research. But even that one is not overwhelmingly preferred. All right. Enough of that was my monologue, just trying to get it out there, what the options are so that our audience is all in the same even playing field of information here. So, Dr. Wright, in your practice, what does your consent form, or if you wanted to not talk about yours, but just the standard consent form, although I'm not sure there is a standard one used by all fertility clinics, what does it say about disposition, and what options are presented to the patients before they even freeze their embryos?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the language that the consent form uses basically states that the embryos are the property of the couple that created them, and that part of the contract they're entering into authorizes us to store their embryos at our facility for a storage fee, and that at any point they want their embryos either disposed of or used for purposes of creating another child or a child for that couple, or if they want them donated for another purpose, such as to research or to another couple, that it is their right to do that, that they just need to follow our laboratory protocols in order for that to occur, which generally involves signing notarized forms authorizing the lab to perform whichever service they are interested in.
All right, and perhaps because of some of the dissatisfaction with the available options, some recent research showed that of 500 people with frozen embryos who had definitely decided not to use them for future attempts at pregnancy, 40% had not decided and had not selected a preferred option. And nearly a fifth of the people indicated that they weren't going to choose, they were going to simply freeze indefinitely. And so the truth is, I think people need information. Patricia, do you see in your practice this indecision or dissatisfaction when you counsel infertility patients on what to do with their unused embryos?
Well, I can't say that in my personal experience this issue comes up a whole lot. And maybe part of that is that when I tend to see certain patients, it's sort of at the beginning of their treatment or in the middle of it, and they may not yet be at that point of, having reached their goal, having achieved a pregnancy or had a child, and then struggling, later on down the road with what to do with excess frozen embryos. So I don't see it all that much, but I certainly know that that those decisions can be delayed because of how difficult it may be to consider that any of those options may really be satisfactory to them. And I think depending on how, and it's very personal, and there may be religious or moral or ethical reasons why couples are struggling or why they even may not want to. I certainly know that sometimes couples work with doctors around limiting potentially based on how much medication is given, the numbers of excess embryos that may exist. I've seen that I've counseled patients around that issue because perhaps they view, depending on what status they may give that embryo, that it may almost feel like a child, their child or their potential child. It may create difficulties. So I know that there are struggling couples out there. I can't say on a daily basis that is one of the major issues that couples come to my office for, but it certainly is out there.
And I think you have a valid point that because we do hear from people, but then we hear from people after they have been successful and they don't know where to turn for information. So that may be why we're hearing from them. Because I think you're right. People beforehand, when they are going through the cycle and they are praying and hoping for a large number of eggs and then a large number of fertilized embryos and then a large number of high-grade embryos to blast, They never in a million years think that there's even a possibility that they're going to end up with the decision of what to do. I mean, the bounty of excess is just not in their mind at that point.
Exactly. And in fact, we often say we have to get up on our soapbox, and maybe Dr. Wright experiences this too, about the issue of multiples and high-order multiples. Couples will come in and say, "Oh, I just hope I get twins."
And, believe me, we have that issue here.
Right. We have to backpedal and say, the mission of our clinic is always one healthy baby, and twins can sometimes be, often be a happy side effect. But when you get into higher order multiples, of course, there are, problems of not only, pregnancy loss, miscarriage, but neonatal difficulties and all the rest. So, yes, I think at those early stages of beginning or being in the midst of a cycle, it's very hard for them to imagine that they'll be in a position of needing to think about disposing extra embryos because they have completed their family or they've stopped treatment.
Dr. Wright, what exactly is meant by thaw and discard as it's traditionally practiced? I mean, exactly how do you go about thawing and discarding?
So the process is fairly straightforward. You would remove the straw, which contains the embryos. So embryos are contained in a very small amount of cryoprotectant and stored in liquid nitrogen. So you would remove the straw and allow the embryo to thaw, which would happen fairly quickly. And then it would be not visualized or assessed by the embryologist at that point, but would simply be discarded with medical waste. So one of my partners referred to it as put in the red bag, with the remainder of the medical waste that the facility has.
Interesting. And so do you see patients who seek an alternative to the traditional disposal method? And let me start with you, Kristen, but then I'd also like to, Patricia. Patricia, you've answered that. You have not really seen that many people who are struggling with the decision. But I guess the question is, do you see people who are trying to seek an alternative to the traditional thaw and discard? Kristen, let me start with you on that one, though.
I would say that we rarely encounter patients who are interested in an alternative discarding procedure. We've had at least one patient in the last couple of years at our clinic who has requested that service. I think that many patients are at home struggling with this and aren't necessarily making contact with their fertility center to make a decision.
I think you're right. Interestingly, why not? But I don't think they're contacting you. I think they're contacting us,
yeah.
But I don't think they're contacting you, which is we'll come back to that in a minute. I did find a little bit of research. There's not much out there on this because, quite frankly, these options. Usually, when you see any research, the research simply talks about thawing and discarding. It doesn't talk about any options. But I did see where there was some relatively recent research that indicated that if presented with the options for compassionate transfer or a disposal ceremony, a not insignificant number of people said that would make it easier for them to decide that they might I think that they would be very likely or probably likely to choose one of those options. So, and Patricia, what about you in your practice? Have you heard of patients at Shady Grove who are seeking some alternative that would help them move past and make the decision and feel comfortable going forward?
Yeah, again, and I chatted with a couple of my colleagues about this before, in preparation for this. And I can't say that I hear a lot of that, of patients who are looking for options. But one thing I was very sort of glad to hear in following up with a couple of the one or two brief articles I came across on this, they raised the issue of when bills are sent to couples whether it's every month or every year, for paying for the storage fees for their embryos. There was a suggestion that maybe, along with that, some paperwork or letter or something go to the couples along the lines of, have you been thinking about this, or are you considering changing your consent form or your ideas about disposal of the embryos? And I was glad to hear that it seems that at our clinic, options for changing disposition of embryos, some kind of letter or form does come along. They're not just sent the bill every year, with the assumption that they're going to want to continue freezing, indefinitely.
Well, that's good to hear.
That was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Wright, what about at your clinic? Do you know what or have you heard from other clinics, if you can speak more broadly, as to whether and it's not, patients need more than just the question, have you thought about it? They need information because, quite frankly, they probably have thought about it, especially when the bill comes, but they don't, not knowing what their options are or what it even means.
And that they can change them. This is Patricia speaking, I'm sorry, but just that they can change them.
Yeah, exactly. They could change them and that they may well want to at this point. What about at your clinic or at other clinics where you have spoken with other REs or embryologists, Kristen?
Yeah, it's a good point. At RSC New England, I'm not exactly sure what the language states in the information that the patient receives when they receive their bill. At the University of Vermont, we did send them information stating the options of discarding their embryos if they were not planning to use them. But there was not language that I was aware of in that letter offering compassionate transfer or offering disposal ceremonies or presenting the embryo to the couple to have them dispose of it as they chose.
I think that would be my reflection as well, that I do know of some clinics, there doesn't seem to be any standardization, but there's some clinics and cryopreservation facilities do send, as the Shady Grove, according to what Patricia's saying, that these are your options, have you thought about it, do you want, most of them, as far as I can tell, are not providing any information for helping patients make a decision, and I don't know of any who have included the options, any type of alternative options, which people might find easier to bring closure. And I think that's the part I want to move us to. First of all, I want to talk specifics, but then I want to move us to the whole idea of closure. But first, let's talk about specifics. When we talk about a compassionate transfer, Dr. Wright, if you could walk us through explain, I did a very, very overly simplistic, although it's not terribly complex, but I did a very simplistic description in my introduction. But if you could more specifically tell us what, in fact, we mean by compassionate transfer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that your explanation was quite good. In our practice, we feel very strongly that we have to make a distinction between performing an embryo transfer that we expect to result or hope to result in a pregnancy versus doing a procedure where the purpose is to dispose of the embryo. And so there's a couple of things that make that distinction. When we perform an embryo transfer with the hopes of achieving a pregnancy, obviously that the transfer of that embryo is placed into the uterus, which is where the embryo would implant and grow. When we do a compassionate transfer, the embryo is placed into the vagina, which is not an environment where it could implant and establish a pregnancy. The second difference is that with an embryo transfer that we hope to result in a pregnancy, we do it at a time in the cycle where the lining of the uterus is receptive to implantation of that embryo and when the woman is fertile and able to become pregnant. With compassionate embryo transfer, we would perform that service usually at the time of menses, so not at a time in a woman's cycle when she is fertile. And for many women, or for some women, that gives them the closure that they need. Many of the embryos that are actually created naturally go through that same process. So many eggs that are fertilized do not actually implant into the uterus and are shed with the menses, and a woman may not even know that she was pregnant during
Likely
that cycle.
Won't, in fact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so in a way, doing the compassionate embryo transfer is very similar to the natural fate of many embryos that are conceived naturally.
I think people don't realize the point, the percentage of and if you could, in any way you want to describe the percentage, but in the normal course of even couples who are, when they're trying to conceive, where sperm meets egg, and the embryo is fertilized but does not implant. Can you give us an estimate on, for a typical person, what percentage of embryos fail to implant?
It's estimated that at least half of embryos that are created where an egg is fertilized don't implant into the uterus and are lost very early after their production, usually at around a time a woman would experience her menses. So a very large majority of embryos actually don't implant and result in pregnancies.
Yeah, I think that's when I have always given that statistic, people are always surprised by that. I think the assumption is that, once sperm meets egg, 9 months later a baby is born, but human reproduction just doesn't work that way.
Yes, we are actually quite infertile as a species, remarkably.
We are, and we're very inefficient at reproduction.
Yes.
So and is it ever possible? We actually did get one question that came in right after we started the show, and she asked, Lisa, she asked, is it possible to transfer the frozen embryo to the uterus at an unfertile time? And I would assume she means after thawing, and I'm also assuming she's talking about compassionate transfer, or is it always transferred to the vagina?
We have discussed this as a physician group, and the concern with transferring it to the uterus is, number one, that makes it more of an invasive medical procedure. Now, it's true that performing an embryo transfer doesn't carry a high degree of risk, but there is a small theoretical risk that you could introduce an infection into the uterus by doing that type of procedure, whereas you don't have that risk if you place the embryo into the vagina. And secondly, it gets a little bit, you get into kind of a gray zone with both insurance issues and also with reporting to the federal government, which we are required to do to report the outcomes of all of our IVF cycles, including frozen embryo transfers. So if you're performing a compassionate transfer to the uterus, it's not clear if that is something that should be reported to the government as we performed this transfer and the woman did not become pregnant. And it's also not clear, you can't bill for certain procedures and not bill for other procedures. So if you're generally billing insurance for an embryo transfer, it gets you get into a gray zone if you're not going to bill that procedure because you've done it for the purposes of a compassionate transfer.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the one alternative in the thawing and discarding is the location of the thawing, I suppose, is one way to, or the discarding, actually, probably more accurate. The thawing takes place very quickly when removed from the gas from the chamber. But so now let's talk about disposal ceremonies, and I suppose that is as diverse as humanity. But when does that take place? And Patricia, let me throw this one to you to begin with, and if you could help talk about some of the diversity of what we mean. I mean, what are we even talking about when we say a disposal ceremony? And then if you could give us any idea of some of the diversity that you've seen or heard of.
Well, I would assume by a ritual. What was the term you used? A ritualistic
disposal ceremony is what I've heard it called.
Right. I would assume that would mean that the couple would want to have some kind of meaningful, some kind of ritual ceremony or whatnot that was meaningful to them. And in fact, I did again, touch base with a couple of people at my clinic, and I think that the consensus among those that I spoke to was that not that this is necessarily come up, but that if a couple did want their, vial, quote unquote, that it would be given to them, and they could take it to do with it what they wished. Again, I have not seen this directly myself or heard of it, but I would imagine that it would mean, some kind of, as I said, ceremony, maybe involving some sort of prayer that they write or saying, or maybe they want to go into a religious facility, or what comes to mind for me and has stayed with me for a long time is a patient who I had seen many years ago, and what she was really grieving and mourning were her she had a number of she had an abortion and then many miscarriages. And so she was really looking for some kind of ritual, some kind of way to mark and ritualize this. And she ended up planting flowers in a garden that would come up every year, and that way it would kind of remind her. And I think in some small way also she had separated out the miscarriages from the abortion. And so this was her way, a meaningful way for her to bring closure and to mark what had happened, that it wasn't just, these weren't non-events that could be dismissed. These were big losses in her life. And so I would imagine that with a disposal ceremony, something like that could be done as well. And I think the key would be what's meaningful to this couple to perhaps bring them some sense of closure and some sense of peace, that that this loss was real to them and not just because it was sort of invisible to the rest of the world, it hadn't occurred, which I think is often how couples feel, be it at the end of a cycle when they're not pregnant, or be it after a miscarriage or whatnot, that there's no visible signs of grieving and no way to kind of comfort the mourners. So I don't know if I addressed your question exactly, but that's been my experience.
We just received an email from Ron. He says, we would want to bury the vial. Is this possible? Dr. Wright, is it, Patricia has indicated that it is possible for a couple who, rather than have the embryologist, which I assume that the embryologist is the typical person who is doing the thawing and discarding, if the couple would like to discard it on their own in any way they see. Is this a possibility for them?
Yes, it is a possibility. It's not something that we've had many couples do, but our laboratory director, Dr. Go, has always offered to present the embryos to the couple, and typically she states that she, shows them the straw, which has the couple's identification information on them, and then places the straw into a container and gives it to the couple for them to do with what they wish. And I think, the disposal ceremony does give, has the opportunity at least to give that couple some sense of closure. It always strikes me how much grieving happens in the infertility world and how little it is recognized by society. As Patricia was saying, that we don't have rituals to recognize that. So I think that it's a nice option for patients.
Well, I do want to actually talk a little about first off, I want to point out that not everybody sees this decision as a monumental decision. The fact that you have not been inundated with people seeking alternatives to the standard methods of disposal is an indication that for probably plenty of people. And I went through, I was attempting to, because I was struck by the indecision of many people that we heard from who couldn't make a decision. I was doing some research for an article a couple of years ago, which I ended up not writing, but nonetheless it was going to be a book and it did not go anywhere. But I interviewed a lot of people who were in the process of who had unused embryos and either were deciding or in the process of deciding or simply were not. And I was struck by that there were some people who simply didn't care. I mean, it just didn't matter to them in the least. And others who really, by their own words, would say agonize over decisions. So I think it's important to say that there is a great deal of diversity and not everybody finds this to be a hard decision. But I think more people find it to be a hard decision than anyone knows, and I think by evidence of that is one, the fact of how few people actually do make the decision and just continue to pay or abandon. So the fact that there's we've got an abandonment issue. We also have a number of people who are just planning on indefinitely storing, and the people that I talked with who are attempting another pregnancy, even though some of them, quite frankly, are saying that they're really hoping that the pregnancy doesn't, that the transfer doesn't work because they really feel like they're probably maxed out. But this is a way of, that's the only way they can feel comfortable with getting rid of the embryos. So I think that at least for some people, this is a more significant issue than is probably, Kristen, as you mentioned, certainly as recognized. But I'm not sure it's always grieving, although I suppose that it could be grief. But is it possible that people are just seeking a closure to what's been a huge portion of their life? Infertility is so all-consuming. Does that factor in as well, Patricia? Just the need to say, okay, this period of our life is now over.
Yes, I would think that that could be helpful, and perhaps disposing of them in some way by any of those options, including compassionate transfer or ritual ceremony, would be a way of saying, yes, we are moving on. There are no embryos hanging out there in embryo land or whatever that we will use someday, and we are declaring we're putting the boundaries around our family. We're closing our family, and I think that I could imagine there could be a lot of struggle, maybe not struggle, but just a decision that needs to be made around that. And I think, as you said earlier, for patients who've been struggling and yearning for so many years often to even have one baby, one child, let alone feel that they have enough, that could be a very significant thing to mark. So perhaps I'm really struck by that point that you seem to be making about it's maybe we're not hearing a lot about it because, again, it's sort of invisible, this delayed decision making, that we're not hearing about it, but we know it's going on just by virtue of the tons of embryos that we know are still frozen and not disposed of in any way.
Yeah, and I have a kind of a greater concern that I feel like that I worry about the presence of the unused embryos. I worry about what they mean. I worry that that it is a kind of a time bomb, if nothing else, from that could hurt infertility treatment in general. There's a great deal of diversity in our country about the moral or the personhood status of embryos. We certainly know that there's legislation being introduced in Mississippi, and it's coming up for a vote shortly, that would give embryos the rights of personhood. And the Resolve Advocacy Committee posted a blog. I let them use my blog last week to talk about, and I recommend everybody take a look at that, because the implications are fairly large for that. Anyway, we certainly know that even absent this legislation, or in this case the constitutional amendment, there's a lot, people have very diverse opinions about what an embryo actually is. And I wonder if the view on what their view on this subject, what they view an embryo is, if that seems to correlate with what options people feel most comfortable choosing. And you may not have, and you may not know. I just want to get your opinion on it. You may not actually know what other people are thinking. But Dr. Wright, do you think that it does matter? I mean, how they are, from your experience, do people choose differently their disposal options depending on their view of an embryo?
Well, I would think that they would. As you said, there's a pretty wide range in how couples view their embryos. There was one study that asked couples who had frozen embryos to rank their embryos as having the highest degree of morality associated with them on a scale of 1 to 7, and the lowest being, that embryos were essentially akin to medical waste or to extra tissue. And there was a huge range in how couples viewed their embryos. And I think that those perspectives, certainly likely do influence the decisions that people make. I think that if couples envision their frozen embryos as being, frozen children, they are less likely to want to discard them. And if they have a different view, I think that they're likely to make a different decision.
But this is Patricia speaking. Just to follow up on that, I think that, and this I certainly have heard from couples that I think that if they view their frozen embryos as being potential children who might very much look, let's say they have been successful and have had a child themselves through in vitro or maybe even twins. And they say, these are children who will be siblings. If I donate these embryos to another couple, anonymously, or even if it's a directed donation to someone I know, these are really siblings, potential siblings of my children. I think that would make the decision very difficult for some couples to know that there were, full siblings of their children being raised in other families, and could bring on a whole host of feelings within themselves, and imagine what kinds of feelings that might bring up in those children as well.
Yes, I think that you're absolutely right, and very few couples ultimately make the decision to donate their embryos for embryo adoption or to another couple, and I think that speaks to that concern that couples have.
Mm-hmm. And that actually is supported by some research. I read a study a couple of years ago, and at first it surprised me, but it certainly fits in exactly with what you're saying, and that was that the respondents in the study that ascribed high importance to concerns over the embryo, fetus, or future child. In other words, they as you put, thought of them as children. Well, actually, I shouldn't put words in the researcher's mouth. They actually said the words they used were high importance to concern about the embryo, fetus, or future child. And those people were more likely to thaw and discard or freeze the embryos indefinitely, or do a compassionate transfer or disposal ceremony. They were less likely to donate to another couple, which in some ways seemed counterintuitive to me. And yet I understand from what you're saying that, I see I can see the point. Why do you think so few clinics offer? Well, in fact, let me back up. It seems to me, and this is not scientific, this is just from me when I have been talking with reproductive endocrinologists, I find that some are adamantly against these alternative disposal methods, to the point where some have told me that they would refuse to perform them. Kristen, I know you can't speak for all doctors or REs, reproductive endocrinologists, but I'm sure you've heard of this opposition as well. Why would some doctors perhaps feel so strongly against offering these options to their patients?
Well, I think that it reflects the potential ambiguity of what you're doing. So, I've made a very clear distinction between what I consider to be a compassionate embryo transfer versus an embryo transfer with the purpose of creating a pregnancy. And I think that physicians are very uncomfortable with doing a medical procedure with no outcome other than closure for the patient, so no potential medical benefit, if you will. And that's why I think that it's important to make the distinction between the type of procedure you're doing when you're doing an embryo transfer versus the type of procedure you're doing when you perform a compassionate embryo transfer. So I think that it's the ambiguity of what you're doing that can make physicians uncomfortable.
One of the things that you talked to, and I was glad you brought it up, and that is clinics are either required or strongly encouraged to report their success statistics both to the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology as well as to the Center for Disease Control. And we link to those statistics, everybody. And we encourage people to consider that when choosing a clinic, although one has to be very circumspect when how we view statistics, because the old standard was the Mark Twain line about statistics and lies. It's easy for statistics not to represent the full story. However, having said that, the reality is success statistics are a big darn deal to most infertility clinics, and I was glad to hear Kristen, you say that in fact this does not have to be reported as a frozen embryo cycle, because obviously it would not help your statistics if the intent is to transfer without a pregnancy and you're reporting your successful pregnancy rates. It would certainly hurt your statistics. Is this universal that all clinics could approach it this way, or is this kind of at this point a little bit of a gray zone that everybody has to figure out for their own?
Yeah, I can't speak to what other clinics do. I think that if you are transferring an embryo into the uterus, I think that gets into a pretty big gray zone about whether or not that medical procedure should be reported. We're required to report by federal law, so it is a requirement. I think if you're placing an embryo into the vagina, I think that everyone would be comfortable saying that is not an embryo transfer. But I think that if you were placing the embryo into the uterus, then I think that you're getting into a gray zone there.
To me that makes really good sense, because putting it into the vagina, there is, and we need for people to realize, as far as I know, and I will ask this in the form of a question, but I don't think there's any way, is there, for this is not like sperm entering a vagina that have the ability to move and move up the vagina into the cervix to meet an egg. This is an embryo that is not. I mean, it's almost impossible for it to find its way into the uterus and implant. Am I understanding the medical jargon here well?
That's correct. Embryos don't have the ability to move the way that sperm do.
Right. So there's no way that this is going to implant.
I just have a question, Dr. Wright, that I hadn't thought of before. What about something like an ectopic pregnancy?
Yeah, I suppose that is theoretically possible, although if you're placing it in the vagina at the time of menses, I've never heard of, a vaginal ectopic pregnancy. There are cervical ectopic pregnancies, but those are usually higher in the cervix. Mm-hmm. So I can't envision a situation where doing, placing an embryo into the vagina at the time of menses would lead to an ectopic pregnancy. I think that would be highly unlikely, and extraordinary if it were to happen.
Because there's not a lining in the uterus, not is it during a woman's period, so it's being flushed out, but
exactly.
Practically speaking, there's no lining in the vagina for which it to attach.
Right. I mean, embryos can implant in places outside the uterus, which is what an ectopic pregnancy is. But if you're placing it at the time of menses, you would expect that embryo to be flushed out. Most embryos that are frozen, when they're placed even into the uterus, even into their optimal environment, wouldn't implant immediately. So many embryos are frozen at the day 3 stage. Those embryos don't typically implant for at least 2 days after that. So, that embryo would have to hang around in the vagina for a significant period of time in order to implant, which is pretty unlikely to happen in the vagina. And the vagina is also not a good environment with respect to pH. The vagina is a fairly acidic environment, which is fairly toxic to embryos. So I think it would be extraordinarily unlikely for that to happen.
Well, one very real concern for disposing of unused embryos is cost. And I've been told by at least one patient that their doctor wanted to charge the cost of a frozen embryo transfer, to do a compassionate transfer. In other words, to charge for the same price as putting it into the... And I actually did not ask then whether or not it was being placed into the uterus or the vagina. As I'm asking the question now, I realize that I did not ask that question when the person... was telling me about this. I had assumed the vagina, but I did not actually ask. So I guess that might make a difference. But anyway, let's talk about cost. What is the cost that most clinics would charge for a compassionate transfer, Dr. Wright?
We haven't performed compassionate transfers enough to have a certain cost associated with the procedure. So it's not typically a service that we have at least discussed charging for. That said, if this became something that became very popular and we had patients, coming to us wanting this procedure, then I think we would have to consider, covering the cost of the service that we're providing. But
why would it be any more than the cost for a vaginal exam? I mean, because basically that's all it is, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think that you would charge the full price of doing, a frozen embryo transfer, since that's not clearly what you're doing, and there are far fewer steps involved. So I think that it would, at this point, we don't have any cost associated with this service. But I think if we were to develop a cost, it would be more reflective of what we're doing, which, as you said, is more similar to a vaginal exam than to a frozen embryo transfer.
Okay. I'm not sure. We've received this question. It's relatively long. I think the basic thing that it's Bethany, and she is asking if it is possible to have a ceremony in the lab. It's a thought, I suppose. Let's talk about that. Is it possible? Would it be possible, Dr. Wright, to do a ceremony in the lab? I guess one could question what would be the advantage of doing it in the lab, and I could see some disadvantages, although perhaps for this particular patient that would be something that they would want to consider. What about that?
Yeah, that isn't something that we have encountered. The concerns with doing it in the lab is that we don't typically allow non-staff into the laboratory for a variety of reasons, sterility, for one, and confidentiality for another. So I would be pretty reluctant to consider, letting people besides our staff inside the laboratory, if that's what that patient, this person is referring to.
And I assume that is what they're referring to, and having some type of, and I think you would have some issues associated with. I think that it would be, although I think that clinics could make it easier for people to receive to have closure. It does seem to me personally, which I don't suppose my personal opinion really matters much here, but it does seem to me that might be more of an imposition, and as you point out. I don't know that we really think it's really in the best interest to have people actually in the lab, which is supposed to be a sterile environment. Yeah.
This is Patricia just adding on. I think that if that were a couple that I knew about, or a patient that I knew about who wanted to go into the lab, I think that I would want to explore with them. What is this all about for them, and what are they trying to accomplish? and what is it they're hoping they would gain emotionally, psychologically by doing it in the lab versus getting the straw or whatever it is and taking it somewhere else. I think I'd want to know really, what are all their feelings associated with this, and what particular meaning it would have to do it in the lab versus anywhere else. And I think maybe understanding that would help towards the physician or the team figuring out with the patient, really what might satisfy those needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. As I mentioned at the very beginning, one of my continued concerns is the idea of creating as many embryos as possible, which is, I don't know if that's 100% still the philosophy for when we enter the first IVF cycle or any IVF cycle. But I worry about whether this is really the best for the patient in trying to conceive now, as well as I worry about this practice that resulting in an increasing surplus of frozen embryos. There seems to be that there should be a better way, and I personally want the infertility medical community to take a lead in finding a better way and promoting it. Dr. Smith, what are you hearing about now as far as, is it still considered best practice to create as many eggs as you can and fertilize as many embryos, fertilize as many eggs and resulting as many embryos? Is that still considered the gold standard for measuring success of a cycle?
Well, the gold standard for measuring success of a cycle is live birth rate per cycle.
Good point.
And also minimizing multiple birth rates, so preferably singleton pregnancies. The challenge is that we don't know how a cycle is going to go until we do the cycle. So, at the outset, we don't know exactly how many eggs a woman will produce with a given stimulation protocol of medications. That number can vary widely based on biology and based on what medicines we choose to give to them. And then of the eggs that are produced, we expect 50 to 70%, so 5 to 7 out of every 10 eggs we expect to fertilize in the laboratory. And then of the embryos that are produced, of the eggs that are fertilized, not all of those embryos will continue to survive in culture. So you see some attrition as you go along, and how much attrition will really vary from individual to individual. Some people may produce, 15 good eggs and have them all fertilized and all produce embryos. Other times, someone might start with 15 follicles, maybe not get 15 eggs at retrieval, not have a good fertilization rate, and so at the end of the cycle, you're left with far fewer embryos to transfer. So that's really the challenge. Our goal isn't to make as many eggs as possible, because if we make too many eggs, then that makes the levels of estrogen in the woman's blood very high, and that can put her at risk for ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. But, we generally will shoot for a higher number so that we can hopefully optimize pregnancy rates.
And therein lies the tension, because as you point out, this is not, we don't have medical insurance coverage. Most people do not. A few states mandate it, and a few insurance companies on their own do it. But so people, just from for no other reason, people may be able to only afford a few cycles or maybe only one cycle. So there is that tension between trying to maximize the opportunity to have at least one baby per cycle, with the trying to be responsible and not produce embryos that we don't ultimately think are going to be transferred with the goal of implantation. So, on that note, we have reached the end of our hour. Thank you so much, Patricia Sachs and Dr. Kristen Smith, for being our guest today on Creating a Family. To get more information on Dr. Kristen Smith or the Reproductive Science Center of New England, the New Hampshire Clinic, you can go to their website at rscnewengland.com. To get more information on Patricia Sachs or the Shady Grove Fertility Counseling, go to shadygrovefertility.com, and then you can click on the link there to the psychological support services. I would also assume that at the rscnewengland.com that you could get information specific on Dr. Kristen or even the New Hampshire Clinic. Thank you for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
I'm here with Jennifer Taniguchi, a senior at Creighton University's Heider College of Business. I hear you're from Hawaii. Tell us why you chose Creighton for your undergraduate education and what internships you've completed as a student at Creighton.
I chose Creighton University's Heider College of Business because ultimately they had numerous internship opportunities. So far, I had 3 internships, one back home at Bank of Hawaii, another at Union Pacific Railroad, which is a Fortune 500 company, and finally one at a Big 4 accounting firm, Deloitte.
Learn more about all of the university's academic programs at creighton.edu.